75 years old, $22 in her checking account, and a neon orange eviction notice stapled to the only front door she had ever known. Margaret Collins stood on the porch, her arthritic fingers trembling as she traced the cold, harsh letters of the vacate order. By Friday, she would be homeless. She had packed everything she owned into 3 cardboard boxes, ready to surrender to the brutal reality of the shelter system. But there was one door in the house she hadn't touched, the basement, locked for 50 years by her late grandmother with a single chilling warning. Only when you have absolutely no other door left to walk through. Maggie, not a second before. The damp cold of a Boston November seeped through the single-pane windows of 42 Sycamore Street, chilling Margaret Collins to her marrow. She sat at the scarred oak kitchen table, a half-empty mug of lukewarm black tea resting between her hands. Spread out before her was a terrifying mosaic of final notices, past-due utility bills, and the crowning jewel of her impending ruin, the eviction order from Ridgefield Property Management. At 75, Margaret had lived a quiet, invisible life. She had worked for 40 years as a public school librarian, retiring with a modest pension that had slowly been devoured by inflation, rising property taxes, and the crippling medical debt left behind by her late husband, Thomas. When Thomas passed a decade ago, he took the warmth of the house with him, leaving Margaret to slowly sink under the weight of an economy that had no use for the elderly and impoverished. She had sold the house to a reverse mortgage company years ago just to keep the lights on, a decision she deeply regretted when the company was acquired by Simon Ridgefield, a ruthless developer, notorious for gutting historic Boston neighborhoods to erect sterile, glass-fronted luxury condominiums. Simon didn't care about the 75-year-old woman living in the drafty Victorian. He cared about the zoning permits. A sharp, impatient knock shattered the morning silence. Margaret didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. She pulled her worn wool cardigan tighter around her frail shoulders and shuffled to the front door. Standing on the porch, flanked by 2 burly men in matching dark jackets, was Peter Pendleton, the property manager for Ridgefield. Peter was a man whose entire demeanor suggested he was perpetually smelling something foul. "Mrs. Collins," Peter said, his voice devoid of any human empathy. He didn't bother to remove his driving gloves as he handed her a clipboard, just a final courtesy check. "The sheriff's deputies will be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to enforce the lockout. I trust you have your arrangements in order?" Margaret looked at him, her gray eyes tired but unyielding. "I've lived here since I was a little girl, Mr. Pendleton. My grandmother built the garden out back with her own hands. Isn't there any grace period?" "Until the spring?" Peter sighed, a heavily exaggerated sound of corporate exhaustion. "We've been through this, Mrs. Collins. You haven't paid the leaseback agreement in 6 months, Mr. Ridgefield has already scheduled the demolition crews for the 14th. You need to be out. If you leave anything behind, it goes into a dumpster. Have a good day." He turned on his heel, the heavy boots of his enforcers echoing on the wooden steps, leaving Margaret staring at the empty street. She closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a judge's gavel. The silence of the house pressed in on her. She had no children. Her few friends had either passed away or moved down to Florida. The city's emergency housing lines had placed her on a wait list that was 3 years long. The reality was stark and inescapable. Tomorrow night, she would be sleeping on a cot in a municipal shelter, surrounded by strangers, her entire life reduced to whatever she could carry in a suitcase. Margaret walked slowly through the parlor, running her hand over the faded floral wallpaper. She had spent the last week selling off her furniture, her mother's silver, and her wedding ring, just to pay off a few lingering debts so she wouldn't die owing the grocer. All that remained were 3 taped cardboard boxes in the hallway. She was ready to leave. She was ready to give up. But as she turned toward the kitchen to wash her solitary teacup, her gaze fell upon the narrow alcove tucked beneath the main staircase. There, shrouded in decades of shadow and dust, sat a heavy, solid oak door, secured by a massive, rusted iron padlock. The basement. Margaret approached the door, the floorboards groaning beneath her worn slippers. She hadn't stood this close to the basement entrance in at least 30 years. The house had originally belonged to her grandmother, Beatrice Montgomery. Beatrice was a formidable, fiercely private woman who had emigrated from London in the early 1920s. She raised Margaret after Margaret's parents died in a tragic streetcar accident when she was only 5. Beatrice was not a warm woman. She didn't bake cookies or tell bedtime stories. She was sharp, calculating, and kept a schedule that baffled young Margaret. She worked as a seamstress by day, but the nights at 42 Sycamore Street were always filled with the sounds of strange, heavy cars pulling into the alley, hushed conversations in the parlor, and the clinking of heavy metal. When Margaret was 10, she had tried to sneak down into the basement out of sheer childhood curiosity. Beatrice had caught her by the collar, her grip like a steel vise. "You never go down there, Maggie," Beatrice had hissed, her eyes dark and terrifyingly serious. "Never. The past is buried down there, and it will eat you alive if you let it out." Decades later, on her deathbed at the age of 92, Beatrice's iron facade had finally cracked. She had pulled a 30-year-old Margaret close, her breath rattling in her lungs. "The house is yours, but the basement, leave it locked. Promise me. Only when you have absolutely no other door left to walk through, Maggie. Not a second before. If the wolves are at the door, look inside the grandfather clock, but only if you are truly ruined." Margaret had honored that promise. Even when Thomas was dying and the medical bills were piling up, she had deemed it a violation of a dying woman's wish to break the lock. She assumed it was just old, painful memories down there, perhaps remnants of a shameful past, or hoarded junk from the Great Depression. But now, the wolves weren't just at the door. They had kicked it down. She was 75, utterly ruined, and facing the absolute destruction of her dignity. She had no other door left to walk through. Margaret turned slowly and looked at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the hallway. It had stopped ticking 20 years ago, its pendulum frozen in time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt alien in her frail chest. She walked over to the clock. The wood was cold. Beatrice had said inside. Margaret opened the glass face panel, but there was nothing. She opened the long waste door where the brass weights hung. Dust motes danced in the pale light. She ran her hands along the inside of the wooden casing, her fingertips brushing against the rough grain. Nothing. Think, Margaret. Grandma Beatrice never made anything easy. She knelt painfully, her knees popping, and reached under the heavy base of the clock. Her fingers felt a small, hollowed-out groove in the floorboard directly beneath the clock's footing. With a grunt of effort, she wedged a butter knife from the kitchen under the floorboard and pried. With a sharp crack, a small piece of the wood splintered away, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside lay a heavy, oilcloth pouch. Margaret pulled it out, her hands shaking violently. She unrolled the cloth. Heavy, cold, and black with age, a massive skeleton key fell into her palm. It was an antique, easily forged a century ago, with complex teeth that looked more suited to a medieval dungeon than a Boston cellar. She carried the key to the basement door. The iron padlock was heavily rusted, a stubborn sentinel that had guarded its secrets for over half a century. Margaret inserted the key. It wouldn't turn. Panic flared in her chest. Had the rust fused the mechanism? She gripped the key with both hands, leaning her entire slight body weight into it, gritting her teeth. With a loud, metallic shriek that echoed through the empty house, the internal tumblers snapped into place. The padlock popped open. Margaret removed the heavy lock, her breath catching in her throat. She gripped the brass doorknob, turning it slowly. The door, heavy and thick, resisted for a moment before yielding, swinging inward with a deep, drawn-out creak. A rush of air hit her face. It didn't smell like mildew, rotting wood, or damp earth, which was what she expected from a century-old basement. It smelled like dried lavender, expensive leather, and old paper. Margaret reached out and flipped the light switch on the wall. Miraculously, A row of amber Edison bulbs, wired independently of the house's main grid, flickered to life, illuminating the wooden staircase that descended into the earth. Taking a deep breath, Margaret gripped the handrail and took her first step down into her grandmother's secrets. The descent felt like walking backward through time. With every creaking step, the ambient noise of the modern city outside the distant sirens, the rumble of traffic faded away, replaced by an absolute, heavy silence. Margaret reached the bottom of the stairs and stood frozen on the landing. She had expected a dirt floor, cobwebs, old canning jars, and maybe some discarded furniture. What she found instead made her drop the heavy iron padlock she had been clutching. It hit the floor with a dull thud. The basement was enormous, stretching far beyond the footprint of the house above it. It had been meticulously walled with red brick and paneled with rich, dark mahogany. The floor was laid with expensive, though dust-covered Persian rugs. It wasn't a storage cellar, it was an office, a sanctuary, a command center. In the center of the room sat a massive, claw-footed mahogany desk. Behind it was a leather executive chair that looked untouched by time. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but they didn't hold books. They held hundreds of black, leather-bound ledgers, each meticulously labeled with gold leaf dates ranging from 1924 to 1971. But the most imposing feature of the room occupied the far wall. It was a staggering, walk-in Mosler bank vault, its thick steel door painted black with gold pinstriping, sitting heavily in the shadows. Grandma Beatrice. Margaret whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling. "What were you?" She walked slowly toward the desk, her slippers shuffling against the luxurious rugs. On the desk, preserved perfectly in the dry, climate-controlled air of the sealed room, sat a vintage Underwood typewriter, a brass banker's lamp, and a single, sealed envelope resting perfectly in the center of a green leather blotter. Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing the thick parchment of the envelope. Written across the front in Beatrice's unmistakable, elegant cursive were two words: for Margaret. She sank into the leather chair. It gave a soft sigh under her weight. With a silver letter opener she found resting near the inkwell, Margaret sliced open the envelope and unfolded the heavy paper. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, I am long gone, and the world above has finally backed you into a corner. I am sorry I forced you to wait until your darkest hour, but you possess a gentle heart, Maggie, too gentle. If I had given you this when you were young, the wolves would have taken it from you, or worse, destroyed you to get it. You knew me as a seamstress, a poor immigrant woman scraping by. That was the mask I wore for the world, to keep us safe. The truth is, I sewed more than dresses. I stitched together the fortunes of this city. During the Prohibition years and the Depression that followed, the most powerful men in Boston, judges, politicians, real estate barons, and bankers, made catastrophic, illegal, and shameful mistakes. When they were on the verge of ruin, they came to the quiet house on Sycamore Street. I fixed their problems, I hid their money, I bought their debts, and I kept their darkest secrets. I never took payment up front. I took promissory notes. I took deeds, collateral, and legally binding contracts signed in blood and desperation. They thought because I was a woman, an immigrant, that I would eventually disappear or forget. I did neither. Anders. Look to the wall of ledgers, Maggie. Look at the names. You will find the grandfathers and fathers of the men who run the city today. They built their empires on money they owe this estate. The combination to the vault is your mother's birthday. Do not weep for the house, Maggie. The house is just wood and glass. What is in this room is power. They think you are a helpless old woman they can throw into the street. It is time to show them exactly whose blood runs in your veins. With love, Beatrice." Margaret lowered the letter, the silence of the room suddenly feeling less like a tomb and more like a loaded gun. She stood up, her arthritic joints protesting, and walked over to the nearest bookshelf. She pulled down a ledger labeled 1965 to 1968. She opened it, scanning the meticulous columns of names, dates, and staggering monetary figures. Her finger stopped on a page dated the 14th of October, 1967. There, signed in bold, arrogant black ink beneath a contract stipulating a heavily leveraged bailout loan that forfeited commercial property rights upon default, was a name that made the blood freeze in Margaret's veins. Peter Ridgefield, Simon Ridgefield's grandfather, the man who founded Ridgefield Holdings, the company that was legally evicting her tomorrow morning to build condos. Margaret stared at the signature, the math quickly turning over in her librarian's mind. With 60 years of compound interest and the collateral clauses outlined on the page, Simon Ridgefield didn't own 42 Sycamore Street. Margaret owned Ridgefield Holdings. Margaret sat perfectly still in the basement's suffocating silence, the 1,967 ledger resting heavy on her lap. The name Peter Ridgefield seemed to burn into the paper. Her trembling hands traced the sprawling, aggressive signature of the man who had laid the foundation for the empire currently trying to destroy her. She needed to see the vault. Standing up, she approached the massive Mosler safe. The black steel was cold to the touch. Beatrice's letter had said the combination was her mother's birthday. Margaret's mother, Abigail, was born on the 14th of September, 1928. Margaret grasped the heavy brass dial. She cleared her throat in the empty room, feeling absurdly like a bank robber. Right to 09. Left past the first number, stopping at 14, right directly to 28. She grasped the heavy chrome lever and pulled downward. A series of deep, metallic clunks echoed from within the door's belly, like ancient bones shifting into place. Margaret planted her feet, gripped the handle with both hands, and threw her meager weight backward. The massive door, balanced on precision hinges, swung open with barely a whisper. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled faintly of copper and old cotton. Margaret reached inside and pulled a dangling pull chain, clicking on a solitary bulb. She gasped, instinctively bringing a hand to her mouth. The vault was lined with steel lockboxes, but the open shelves were what caught her eye. Neatly stacked on the middle tier were bricks of cash. Not modern, brightly colored currency, but old, small-head $100 bills wrapped in brittle paper bands. Beside them sat 3 heavy canvas bags bearing the stamp of a defunct Boston bank, sagging under the unmistakable weight of gold and silver coins. But Margaret, a librarian to her core, bypassed the money. Her eyes locked onto a row of thick, red, expanding files sitting on the top shelf. They were organized alphabetically. She pulled down the file marked RS. Carrying it back to the mahogany desk, she opened it under the glow of the banker's lamp. It was a treasure trove of leverage. Inside were original, notarized deeds, photographs, and blackmail material that could unseat half the city council. But she was looking for one thing. She found a heavy manila envelope marked Ridgefield Holdings, promissory, and collateral. She spread the documents across the green leather blotter. There was the original loan agreement, $500,000 borrowed by Peter Ridgefield in 1967 to save his first major commercial development from foreclosure. But it was the collateral clause that made Margaret's breath hitch. Peter hadn't just put up his properties. He had pledged a 51% controlling stake in Ridgefield Holdings itself, should the loan, plus compound interest, fail to be repaid within 10 years. A supplementary document, dated 1978 and stamped by a private notary, confirmed the default. Peter Ridgefield had never paid Beatrice back. Instead of liquidating the company, Beatrice had held the default in perpetuity, hiding the lien under a shell corporation called Sycamore Trust. When the reverse mortgage company bought Margaret's house, they hadn't found the lien because Beatrice had buried it deep within the city's archaic paper archives, long before digital records existed. Margaret looked at the clock on the desk. It was 3 a.m. In 5 hours, Simon Ridgefield's people would arrive to throw her onto the street. Margaret didn't feel 75 anymore. The arthritis in her knees seemed to recede, replaced by a surge of cold, razor-sharp adrenaline. She gathered the Ridgefield files, a stack of old $100 bills, and a heavy brass paperweight. She was not going to a shelter today. She was going to war. Friday morning broke with the harsh, flat gray light typical of a Boston November. The street outside 42 Sycamore was quiet until 7:45 a.m., when the heavy rumble of a diesel engine shattered the peace. A large, white box truck pulled up to the curb, followed closely by a sleek, black Lincoln Navigator and a marked county sheriff's cruiser. Margaret sat in her parlor. She hadn't slept a wink. She had bathed, done her hair, and dressed with meticulous care. She wore a tailored black wool skirt, a crisp white blouse, and her late husband Thomas's heavy tweed blazer, the sleeves rolled up to fit her small frame. Around her neck, she wore Beatrice's antique pearl choker, a piece she had retrieved from the vault. She sat in a high-backed armchair facing the front door, her posture perfectly straight. The red file folder rested on her lap. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden porch stairs. A loud, authoritative knock rattled the door frame. "County Sheriff," a gruff voice called out. "Mrs. Collins, we have a court order to secure the premises. Please open the door." Margaret stood smoothly, leaving the file on the chair. She walked to the door and unlatched it, pulling it open. Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man with a tired face, stood on the porch, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him stood Peter Pendleton, holding his clipboard and smirking. And behind Peter, leaning against the railing with a cup of artisanal coffee, was Simon Ridgefield himself. Simon was 50, tanned, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Margaret's yearly pension and exuding an aura of absolute impatience. "Good morning, Margaret," Simon said, his tone dripping with faux sympathy. "A difficult day, I know, but progress marches on. Peter tells me you haven't packed everything. The boys will help you move your boxes to the curb." "Ma'am," Sheriff Miller said softly, tipping his hat. "I'm sorry, but I have a writ of possession here. You have to vacate the property immediately. By law, Ridgefield Management takes full possession at 8 o'clock. He checked his watch. "It's 8:01. Margaret looked at the sheriff, then shifted her gaze to Simon Ridgefield. Her gray eyes, usually warm and deferential, were as hard as flint. "Good morning, Sheriff," Margaret said, her voice steady and echoing clearly in the crisp morning air. "I won't be needing the box truck, and I won't be vacating. I am, however, invoking my rights as the majority shareholder of Ridgefield Holdings to terminate this eviction." A heavy silence fell over the porch. Peter Pendleton let out a short, barking laugh. "She's gone senile, Mr. Ridgefield. The stress of the move. I'll get the men to start hauling." "Wait," Simon said, his brow furrowing. He stepped forward, looking down at the frail woman in the oversized tweed jacket. "What did you just say?" "I said," Margaret repeated, stepping back and gesturing into the parlor, "that I think you and your legal counsel need to come inside, Simon, because if your men cross this threshold, I will have them arrested for trespassing on my property, and then I will liquidate your company." Sheriff Miller frowned, looking between the billionaire developer and the elderly librarian. "Mrs. Collins, the court order is valid. I have to enforce it unless a judge says otherwise." "The court order was filed fraudulently, Sheriff," Margaret said calmly, "because Mr. Ridgefield does not own this property. In fact, as of my discoveries last night, he doesn't even own the car he drove here in." She locked eyes with Simon. "Bring your lawyer inside." 5 minutes. If I'm crazy, you can drag me out by my heels." Simon stared at her, an unsettling feeling crawling up his spine. The old woman wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She looked like a predator. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Sterling," he barked into the receiver. "Get out of the car and get in here." Richard Sterling, lead counsel for Ridgefield Holdings, was a man who billed $1,000 an hour to make problems disappear. He walked into the faded parlor of 42 Sycamore Street, looking profoundly annoyed, his leather briefcase in hand. Simon, Peter, and the sheriff stood awkwardly in the living room. Margaret returned to her armchair and picked up the red file. "Make this quick, Mrs. Collins," Simon snapped, checking his Rolex. "My demolition crew is on standby." "Take a seat, Mr. Sterling," Margaret directed, pointing to the sofa. Sterling remained standing. "I prefer to stand." "What is this about, ma'am? You have no legal standing here." Margaret opened the red file. "In 1967, your grandfather, Peter Ridgefield, was facing federal indictment for bank fraud and the complete collapse of his real estate portfolio. To avoid prison and bankruptcy, he borrowed $500,000 from a private financier." Simon scoffed. "Ancient history. My grandfather paid off all his creditors before he died." "Not all of them," Margaret said. She slid a fragile, yellowed piece of heavy parchment across the coffee table. Sterling sighed and picked it up. He began to skim it, his eyes moving rapidly. Suddenly, his reading slowed. He stopped. He pushed his designer glasses up his nose and read the paragraph again. The color began to drain from his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. "What is it, Richard?" Simon asked, irritated. Sterling didn't answer. He carefully set the paper down and looked at Margaret. "Where did you get this?" "My grandmother," Margaret replied softly. "Beatrice Montgomery." "Richard, what is it?" Simon demanded, stepping forward. "It's a promissory note," Sterling said, his voice unusually tight. "Signed by your grandfather. And a collateral deed of forfeiture." "So? It's 60 years old. The statute of limitations." "There is no statute of limitations on this, Simon," Sterling interrupted, his professional composure cracking. "It's a perpetual lien secured by a private trust. The collateral put up for the loan was a 51% stake in Ridgefield Holdings, along with the master deed to the corporate flagship properties. The loan went into default in 1978. It was notarized and filed with the city under a shell company, Sycamore Trust. Sycamore Trust. Peter Pendleton breathed, his eyes widening. "That's the entity that holds the original deed to this house. The reverse mortgage company could never track down the trust officers to clear the title, so they pushed the sale through with a blind indemnity clause." "Which means," Sterling said, looking sick to his stomach, "Ridgefield Holdings bought a house with a dirty title." "We don't own 42 Sycamore Street." "And the company?" Simon asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. Sterling looked at the elderly woman sitting in the armchair. "With 60 years of compound interest at the rate specified in this contract. Simon, she owns the lien on the entire corporate structure. If she files this with the SEC and calls in the debt, the company goes into immediate receivership. She has the right to seize 51% of your voting stock." The silence in the parlor was absolute, heavy enough to suffocate them. The distant sound of the idling box truck outside felt like it belonged to another universe. Margaret slowly closed the red file folder. She looked at Simon Ridgefield, whose arrogant, tanned face had turned the color of ash. "Mr. Pendleton," Margaret said, turning her attention to the property manager. "You told me yesterday that if I left anything behind, it would go into a dumpster." Peter swallowed hard, unable to speak. "I think," Margaret continued, her voice echoing the cold, calculated power of Beatrice Montgomery, "that it is time for you and your men to get off my porch. Because if you are not gone in 30 seconds, Simon, I am going to call the SEC, and then I am going to take your building, your company, and that very expensive car." Simon Ridgefield stared at her, his jaw slack. The billionaire was looking into the eyes of a 75-year-old librarian with $22 in her checking account, and he realized with absolute certainty that he had just lost his empire. The absolute, suffocating silence on the porch of 42 Sycamore Street was suddenly shattered by the frantic, obnoxious buzzing of Simon Ridgefield's cell phone. The sound cut through the crisp Boston morning like a dentist's drill. Simon didn't reach for it. He stood frozen, his bespoke Italian leather shoes planted on the peeling painted wood of Margaret's porch, his eyes locked on the frail, impeccably dressed woman standing before him. The arrogant bravado that had radiated from the billionaire just 10 minutes prior was melting off him like wax in a furnace. "You're bluffing," Simon finally rasped. The tremor in his voice betrayed the absolute panic seizing his chest. He took a step forward, trying to physically loom over the 75-year-old librarian, a classic intimidation tactic he had used to crush countless rivals. "You cannot simply pull a 60-year-old piece of rotting parchment from a basement and claim half of a multi-billion-dollar holding company. It's absurd. It's a fairy tale." Margaret didn't flinch. She stood perfectly upright, her hands resting calmly on the handle of her late husband Thomas's heavy wooden cane. "It is not a fairy tale, Simon. It is a legally binding perpetual lien. Your grandfather signed it in blood and desperation, and your company has been operating under its shadow for half a century without you even knowing. I have an army of litigators, Mrs. Collins." Simon snarled, the color rushing back to his face in a flush of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at her. "I have entire floors of corporate sharks who specialize in burying people. We will file injunctions. We will demand discovery. We will tie this up in appellate courts until you are dead and buried. You think you can fight a war of attrition against me?" Peter Pendleton, the property manager, had retreated to the bottom step of the porch, looking physically ill. Simon turned to his lead counsel. "Richard, tell this delusional old woman exactly what we are going to do to her." Richard Sterling, a man who billed $1,000 an hour precisely because he never lost his composure, was currently losing his composure. He was staring at the yellowed deed of forfeiture in his hands as if it were a live grenade. He adjusted his designer glasses, a thin sheen of nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the biting November wind blowing off the Charles River. "Simon," Sterling began, his voice tight, lacking all of its usual courtroom theatricality. The document is notarized. The seal is authentic to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, circa 1967. And the forfeiture clause is tied to the Sycamore Trust. That's a closed entity private trust. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts has notoriously ironclad precedents protecting private trusts against statute of limitation expirations in cases of concealed defaults. "Speak English, Richard," Simon bellowed, his voice cracking. "It means it's bulletproof," Sterling snapped, finally looking up from the paper. "Your grandfather used the controlling shares of Ridgefield Holdings as collateral for a $500,000 cash injection. When he defaulted in 1978, the trust absorbed the equity. By the strict letter of corporate law, Ridgefield Holdings hasn't belonged to your family since Jimmy Carter was in the White House. It belongs to whoever controls the Sycamore Trust." Sterling slowly turned his gaze to Margaret. "Which, I presume, is you, Mrs. Collins." "I am the sole surviving executor," Margaret confirmed softly, her gray eyes as cold and deep as a winter ocean. Simon let out a sharp, derisive laugh that bordered on hysterical. "Fine. Let's say the paper is real. Let's say she actually has a claim. It doesn't matter. Justice in this country goes to the one who can afford the gas to keep the engine running." He stepped closer to Margaret, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I know everything about you, Margaret. Peter pulled your financials before we served the eviction notice. You have exactly $22.14 in your checking account. Your pension barely covers your groceries. You can't even afford to hire a paralegal to file this piece of paper, let alone retain a firm to fight me." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "I am going to starve you out. I will throw you onto the street today, and I will drag this out until you pass away in a municipal cot." Margaret held his gaze. She didn't blink. She felt the spirit of Beatrice Montgomery, the ruthless, calculating immigrant who had built an empire in the shadows, flow through her veins. calcifying her spine. "Sheriff Miller," Margaret said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet neighborhood. The heavy-set sheriff, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am. If Mr. Ridgefield attempts to step past the threshold of my front door, I want him arrested for attempted burglary and trespassing." "Now wait just a damn minute," Simon started, lunging forward as if to grab the red file folder from the chair inside the doorway. Faster than Simon could register, Sheriff Miller moved. He stepped squarely between the billionaire and the elderly woman, resting his thick hand firmly on the butt of his holstered service weapon. It wasn't a threat, but it was an undeniable barrier. "Back up, Mr. Ridgefield," the sheriff growled, his voice dropping an octave. "The lady asked you to keep your distance. The eviction is officially contested. This is now a civil matter regarding corporate ownership, and until a judge tells me otherwise, this house belongs to her. Step back." Simon stumbled backward, shocked by the physical reprimand. Margaret gave the sheriff a curt, appreciative nod. Then, she turned her attention to the high-priced lawyer. "Mr. Sterling, what is your firm's standard retainer for a hostile corporate takeover defense of this magnitude?" Sterling blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden administrative question. Our standard retainer for Tier 1 corporate litigation begins at $1.5 million, Mrs. Collins, which, as my client pointed out, is capital you do not possess. "Are you familiar with Harrison Caldwell?" Margaret asked casually. The name dropped onto the porch like an anvil. Harrison Caldwell was the apex predator of Boston's legal district. He was a ruthless, terrifying litigator who had dismantled monopolies, unseated corrupt politicians, and destroyed rival firms with surgical precision. Sterling turned pale at the mere mention of him. "I am familiar with Mr. Caldwell," Sterling said cautiously. "I assumed so," Margaret replied. She turned slowly, leaning slightly on her cane, and walked back into the shadowy parlor. The men on the porch waited in agonizing silence. The only sound was the distant rumble of the idling box truck that had come to haul away Margaret's life. A minute later, she reappeared. She was carrying two heavy, faded canvas bags. They looked like old bank deposit sacks, the fabric worn and stained with decades of dust. The physical effort required to carry them was evident in the tight lines around Margaret's mouth and the white-knuckle grip of her arthritic fingers. She reached the wooden porch railing and hoisted the bags onto the flat banister. The heavy, dense thud caused the old wood to groan loudly in protest. With slow, deliberate movements, Margaret untied the thick, frayed drawstrings of the mines of the first bag. She reached inside and pulled out a tightly wrapped brick. Sterling leaned in, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. Simon stopped breathing altogether. It was cash. But it wasn't modern currency. It was a brick of small-head $100 bills, the kind printed in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The paper band wrapping the brick was brittle and stamped with the logo of a bank that had collapsed during the Great Depression. Margaret pulled out another brick, and another, stacking them neatly on the railing. They smelled of dry mint, old cotton, and buried secrets. Then she untied the second bag. She didn't pull anything out. She simply gripped the bottom of the heavy canvas sack and tipped it forward. A cascade of brilliant, heavy metal spilled out, clinking and chiming against the wood with a sound that triggered a primal, greedy instinct in every man watching. They were coins, hundreds of them, large, thick, and gleaming with the unmistakable, rich luster of pure, unadulterated gold. "Saint Gaudens double eagles," Sterling whispered, his voice entirely devoid of breath. He was staring at a fortune in raw, historical gold. "My God, I don't need a checking account, Simon," Margaret said, her voice slicing through the winter air. "I have my grandmother's rainy day fund, and as you can see, it is pouring." Simon stared at the gold, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You can't just—" "Mr. Sterling," Margaret interrupted, ignoring Simon entirely. She looked directly into the lawyer's eyes, her gaze pinning him in place. "As we have established, I hold a perpetual lien with a 51% clause over Ridgefield Holdings. This means, effectively, immediately, I am the majority shareholder of the corporation you represent." Sterling swallowed hard. "Legally, yes, Mrs. Collins. Pending judicial review, you hold the controlling interest." "Excellent," Margaret said, a terrifyingly serene smile touching her lips. "Because I want you to explain to Mr. Ridgefield what happens if he attempts to use Ridgefield Holdings' corporate capital to pay your firm to fight me." Sterling closed his eyes, the realization hitting him like a freight train. He opened them and looked at his soon-to-be former boss. "Simon," Sterling said, his voice hollow, "if she owns 51% of the company, the corporate treasury belongs to her. If you authorize the transfer of company funds to pay my legal fees to fight her, you are using her money without her consent." "It's called corporate embezzlement, Simon," Margaret clarified sharply. "A federal felony. The moment you write a check to Mr. Sterling, I will have the FBI arrest you for wire fraud and the theft of shareholder assets." The trap was sprung. The steel jaws snapped shut. Simon Ridgefield was completely paralyzed. He couldn't use his own company's money to fight her because she owned the company. And if he tried to fight her using his personal wealth, he would be going up against Harrison Caldwell, a man who would gleefully bleed him dry in a matter of months, funded by a seemingly bottomless well of untraceable Depression-era gold and cash. "So, Mr. Sterling," Margaret continued, tapping a gold double eagle against the wood, "you have a fiduciary duty to the majority shareholder. If you do not immediately file a cease and desist on this eviction, recognize my claim, and begin the legal transfer of assets, I will take this gold across town to Mr. Caldwell, and my very first instruction to him will be to have you disbarred for gross corporate malpractice and breach of fiduciary duty." Sterling, a man of pure, calculating legal pragmatism, recognized exactly which way the wind was blowing. The hurricane had just made landfall, and Simon Ridgefield was standing on the beach without a life jacket. "Sheriff," Sterling said, clearing his throat and violently adjusting his silk tie, "please inform your deputies to stand down immediately. The writ of possession is legally contested, compromised, and suspended pending a comprehensive federal and corporate review." "Richard, what the hell are you doing?" Simon roared, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. He grabbed the lawyer by the shoulder. "You work for me. I work for the company, Simon," Sterling shouted back, slapping Simon's hand away. "And she is the company. It's over. If you fight this right now, you go to federal prison. We are standing down." Sheriff Miller let out a long, heavy breath, a profound look of respect crossing his tired, weathered features. He looked at the frail librarian who had just executed the most brutal corporate slaughter he had ever witnessed. He tipped his hat. "Have a good day, Mrs. Collins. Stay warm." He turned and signaled to the box truck driver. The heavy diesel engine rumbled as the driver slammed it into gear, the truck slowly backing away from the curb and lumbering down Sycamore Street in defeat. Margaret carefully swept the gold coins and the bricks of cash back into the heavy canvas bags. She pulled the drawstrings tight. She looked at Simon Ridgefield, who was staring at the ground, his posture completely shattered, looking 20 years older than he had when he arrived. "I expect to see you at the Ridgefield Holdings boardroom on Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Simon," Margaret commanded, her tone brooking absolutely no argument. "Bring the executive board. Bring all of them. And if you attempt to shred, delete, or hide a single financial record between now and Monday, I will hand the 1,965 ledgers I found downstairs directly to the Attorney General." She picked up her canvas bags, the weight no longer seeming to bother her at all. "Get off my porch," Margaret said. She stepped backward into the parlor and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The loud, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded less like a lock and more like a judge's gavel coming down, sealing the absolute destruction of Simon Ridgefield's empire. The penthouse boardroom of Ridgefield Holdings sat on the 52nd floor, a sterile, hyper-modern cathedral of glass, chrome, and imported Italian marble. It offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Boston skyline, a skyline this very corporation had spent 3 generations aggressively carving up, gentrifying, and monetizing. On Monday morning at 8:45, the atmosphere inside this glass-walled sanctuary was absolutely toxic. The air felt thin, vibrating with a frantic, suppressed panic that none of the room's occupants were accustomed to feeling. 6 members of the executive board, an assembly of billionaires and heirs to vast East Coast real estate fortunes, sat in high-backed, white leather chairs. They were murmuring in hushed, angry tones. These were people who moved markets with a phone call, individuals who considered city zoning laws to be mere suggestions. Yet today, they looked like cornered animals. Simon Ridgefield sat at the head of the massive, custom-milled mahogany table. He looked as though he had aged a decade over the weekend. His normally immaculate, bespoke suit looked slightly rumpled. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot and ringed with deep, bruised shadows. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Beside him sat Richard Sterling, the lead corporate counsel, who was furiously reviewing a stack of copied documents, looking like a man meticulously preparing the paperwork for his own execution. "This is completely unacceptable, Simon," hissed Eleanor Carmichael, a severe, icy woman whose family owned the largest commercial retail footprint in Massachusetts. She tapped a platinum pen against the mahogany. "You drag us in here on a Monday morning because of some archaic clerical error? A septuagenarian librarian has a piece of 60-year-old paper and you halted the Sycamore demolition?" "It's not a clerical error, Eleanor," Sterling muttered, not looking up from his files. "It's a perpetual lien secured by a private trust that absorbed 51% of this holding company's equity before any of us were sitting at this table. She has the gold to fund a scorched earth litigation campaign, and she has the legal precedent to win it." "Nonsense," scoffed William Bradley, the senior-most board member. Bradley was a man of old-money arrogance, whose family essentially owned the Harbor District. He checked his solid gold Patek Philippe watch, his face flushed with irritation. "I don't care what century the paper is from. We have the capital to crush her. We'll offer her a settlement, force an NDA down her throat, and be done with it. I have a tea time at 1. "You don't understand, William," Simon rasped, his voice hollow and broken. "She didn't just have one piece of paper. She had a vault, an entire vault." Before Bradley could demand an explanation, the digital clock on the wall silently rolled over to 9 a.m. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Margaret Collins walked in. The contrast was jarring, almost theatrical. In a room designed to project absolute corporate dominance and modern wealth, Margaret looked like an apparition from another era. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy blue dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly. She walked slowly, her steps measured, leaning heavily on her late husband Thomas's polished wooden cane. She carried a worn, faded leather satchel over one shoulder. She looked completely out of place. Yet the moment her sensible black shoes stepped onto the imported marble, the gravity of the room immediately shifted to orbit around her. Following closely behind her was Harrison Caldwell, towering, silver-haired, and radiating pure, predatory menace. Caldwell was the most feared corporate litigator on the eastern seaboard. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than a luxury car, and his mere presence in the room caused Richard Sterling to visibly flinch. Margaret had paid Caldwell's retainer in Depression-era Double Eagle gold coins on Friday afternoon, and Caldwell looked like a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. "Mrs. Collins," Simon said, his voice tight. He attempted to stand, a reflex of corporate diplomacy, but his knees seemed weak, and he sank back down. "Please, take a seat. I'm sure we can come to a reasonable down." "I prefer to stand, Mr. Ridgefield," Margaret interrupted softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a crystalline clarity that commanded absolute silence. She walked to the opposite end of the long mahogany table, directly facing Simon. Harrison Caldwell stood silently at her right shoulder like a sharply dressed executioner. Margaret placed her faded leather satchel on the polished table. The soft thud seemed to echo in the cavernous room. "And we are not here to negotiate. We are here for a surrender." William Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh, unable to contain his indignant rage. He stood up, leaning his knuckles on the table. "Now listen here, lady. I don't know what kind of senile fantasy you're operating under, but this is the real world. You dug up an ancient piece of paper and ambushed Simon. Fine, well played, but you are out of your depth." Bradley reached inside his jacket, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and slapped it onto the table. "The board convened an emergency vote this morning. We are prepared to offer you a $50 million cash settlement to buy out this absurd lien, surrender the original documents, and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Take the money. Go buy an island. Go buy a dozen houses. Leave the business of running this city to us." He slid a drafted contract across the smooth wood. It stopped a few inches from Margaret's hands. Margaret didn't even glance at the contract. She kept her gray, unblinking eyes fixed on William Bradley. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret opened the brass buckles of her worn leather satchel. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy, black, leather-bound ledger. The gold leaf lettering on its spine was faded, but the book itself was immaculately preserved. The sudden smell of old paper and dried binding glue drifted into the sterile, climate-controlled air of the boardroom. She flipped the ledger open to a bookmarked page. She ran her arthritic finger down a column of meticulous, cursive handwriting. "William Bradley, Sr.," Margaret read aloud. Her tone was conversational, yet it cut through the room like a scalpel. "April 14th, 1958. Bradley frowned, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. "What does my father have to do with this?" Margaret didn't look up. She kept reading. "Borrowed $2 million in untraceable cash from Beatrice Montgomery to cover up a union-busting racketeering scandal on the South Boston docks. A scandal that left 3 striking dockworkers dead, their bodies concealed in wet cement at your family's Pier 4 development." The silence in the room became absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying quiet. Bradley's face instantly drained of all blood, turning the color of wet ash. "To secure this bailout," Margaret continued, turning the page, "William Bradley Sr. put up 30% of the voting shares of Bradley Shipping as collateral, alongside a signed, notarized confession of the bribery used to keep the police chief looking the other way. The debt would be never repaid. The collateral was quietly absorbed by the Sycamore Trust." Margaret finally looked up, meeting Bradley's terrified eyes. "I don't need your $50 million, Mr. Bradley, because according to this ledger, I own 1/3 of your shipping empire, and I hold the confession that would historically ruin your family's name and strip your current company of its federal port contracts." Bradley collapsed backward into his white leather chair as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing silently. Margaret reached into the satchel again. She pulled out a second ledger, this one slightly thicker. She let it drop onto the mahogany table with a heavy, definitive smack. She looked directly at the icy retail heiress. "Eleanor Carmichael," Margaret said. Eleanor stiffened, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Whatever you think you have, Peter Carmichael, 1971. Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining a hard, unforgiving edge. "An extortion payoff funded by the Sycamore Trust to keep your father out of federal prison. He embezzled $6 million from the city's municipal pension funds to cover his gambling debts and a string of catastrophic commercial failures. Collateral for the Sycamore loan. The master deed to the Carmichael Plaza in downtown Boston." Margaret closed the book, resting her hands on top of the dark leather. She swept her gaze across the terrified faces of the most powerful people in the city. They were billionaires who had spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable. In less than 3 minutes, an elderly librarian had systematically dismantled their reality. My grandmother, Beatrice, did not just own Simon's grandfather, Margaret said, the power in her voice resonating off the glass walls. She owned all of your fathers. They built this city on stolen money, hidden sins, and desperate bailouts. And because they were arrogant, because they thought she was just a poor, uneducated immigrant woman sewing dresses on Sycamore Street, they assumed she would simply take her secrets to the grave. Margaret leaned forward, gripping her wooden cane. She gave those secrets to me. I spent the weekend reading them. I hold the collateral on every major asset in this room. I hold the proof of the fraud, the theft, and the blood that built the chairs you are currently sitting in. What do you want? Simon whispered. He looked completely broken, a king stripped of his crown, his armor, and his kingdom. You want to destroy us? You want to burn it all down? No, Simon, Margaret said softly, the anger fading into a profound, resolute calm. I am a librarian. I organize messes. I preserve history. I build things up. I do not tear them down. But I am changing the management. She gave a slight nod to her right. Harrison Caldwell stepped forward with a shark-like grin. He opened his bespoke leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of thick, heavily tabbed legal packets, tossing one roughly in front of each board member. Effective immediately, Margaret announced. Simon Ridgefield is permanently removed as Chief Executive Officer of Ridgefield Holdings. Peter Pendleton is fired. The holding company itself is being formally absorbed into a newly formed, non-profit entity, the Montgomery Collins Trust. Simon stared at the packet in front of him, paralyzed. Furthermore, Margaret continued, the luxury condominium project slated for the Sycamore district is permanently canceled. You will be redirecting all allocated capital and construction resources for that project to build a high-density, affordable community housing initiative. Alongside it, you will build a free public health clinic and a state-of-the-art municipal library. Eleanor Carmichael gasped. You're gutting our flagship development to build charity wards? You'll tank our profit margins. The board will never approve the reallocation of those funds. Your profit margins, Margaret corrected, her voice snapping like a whip, were built on the desperation of people like me. People you throw onto the street without a second thought to build glass towers for the ultra-wealthy. You do not have a choice, Eleanor. You will do exactly as I instruct. You will run the construction at cost, and you will use your political leverage to fast-track the permits. Margaret picked up her worn leather satchel, leaving the 2 ledgers sitting on the mahogany table like unexploded bombs. If any of you attempt to fight me, Margaret said, her tone dropping to a chillingly quiet register. If you try to tie me up in court, or if you ever try to evict another vulnerable person in this city to pad your portfolios, I will initiate every single forfeiture clause in my grandmother's vault. I will bankrupt every family in this room, and I will hand the original ledgers to the federal government and let them sort through the ashes of your legacies. She turned away from the table, her cane clicking softly against the marble floor as she walked back toward the frosted glass doors. Harrison Caldwell lingered for a fraction of a second, tapping the legal packet in front of the stunned Richard Sterling before following his client. Margaret paused at the threshold. She looked back over her shoulder at the 6 destroyed billionaires. Mr. Sterling will handle the transition paperwork, Margaret said. Do not test me. I have 80 years of your family's sins sitting in a fireproof vault, and unlike my grandmother, I am not afraid to open the door. The glass doors hissed shut behind her, leaving the masters of the universe sitting in absolute, shattered silence, entirely at the mercy of the woman they had tried to throw away. A year later, the biting, unforgiving cold of November returned to the streets of Boston, but the drafty chill that had once plagued 42 Sycamore Street was gone. Margaret Collins sat in her parlor, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea resting on the mahogany end table. The faded, peeling floral wallpaper had been painstakingly restored by heritage craftsmen. The rattling, single-pane windows were replaced with custom, historically accurate double panes that sealed out the winter wind, and a fire crackled merrily in the cleaned hearth. She wore a thick knit sweater, not out of desperate necessity, but for simple comfort. The transition of power had not been entirely seamless. Men who have spent their entire lives treating the world as their personal chessboard do not surrender gracefully. 3 weeks after the boardroom coup, Simon Ridgefield had attempted a desperate backdoor legal maneuver, trying to use a Delaware shell corporation to freeze Margaret's assets and contest the Sycamore Trust's legitimacy in a federal appellate court. He had severely underestimated the ruthless efficiency of Harrison Caldwell. Margaret hadn't even needed to step into a courtroom. Caldwell simply took a single, heavily redacted photograph of a 1,965 ledger page, specifically detailing a massive, illegal offshore wire transfer orchestrated by Simon's father, and leaked it to a senior investigative reporter at the Boston Globe. The financial fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Ridgefield Holdings stock plummeted 22% in 48 hours. Terrified of federal indictments and public ruin, the executive board turned on Simon like a pack of starving wolves. William Bradley and Eleanor Carmichael led the charge, brutally voting to sever Simon from the company entirely, stripping him of his severance package and exiling him to early retirement at a mid-tier golf community in Boca Raton. They fell in line immediately after that, terrified of the quiet, 76-year-old widow who held their family legacies by the throat. Outside Margaret's window, the neighborhood was alive. The massive, abandoned dirt lots that Simon had aggressively cleared to build sterile, multi-million-dollar condominiums were now the bustling epicenter of the Thomas Collins Community Housing Initiative. It was a sprawling, beautifully designed complex of red brick and green spaces that fit perfectly into the historic aesthetic of the city. It offered strictly rent-controlled apartments to the elderly, working-class families, and displaced locals. On the ground floor of the main building, a free public health clinic was currently operating under the direction of Dr. Gregory Hayes, fully subsidized by the newly formed Montgomery Collins Trust. And right beside it stood a state-of-the-art municipal library, its shelves stocked with thousands of pristine volumes. Margaret stood up, her arthritic joints protesting only mildly, and walked into the hallway. She paused next to the silent, imposing grandfather clock. She looked down the short corridor toward the basement door. The heavy, rusted iron padlock that had guarded the entrance for half a century was gone. In its place was a thick, modern steel vault door, secured by a state-of-the-art biometric scanner. Over the past year, Margaret had come to deeply understand the grandmother she had once feared. Beatrice Montgomery had not hoarded the city's darkest secrets out of malice or a desire to rule from the shadows. She was a poor, vulnerable immigrant woman who recognized that in a world run by ruthless men, leverage was the only true currency. She had built a fortress of blackmail to ensure her bloodline would never be victimized. Beatrice had locked the door with that chilling warning because she knew that power, left unchecked, consumes the people who hold it. She had forced Margaret to wait until she had nothing left to lose, knowing that only a woman who had experienced true powerlessness could wield that kind of destructive leverage without becoming corrupted by it. Margaret didn't use the basement to destroy the city. She used it as a heavy, unyielding shield to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She pressed her hand gently against the cold steel of the biometric lock, a silent thank you to the brilliant, formidable woman who had saved her life from beyond the grave. Margaret turned back to her warm, brightly lit hallway, retrieved her wool coat from the rack, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. She was heading to the new library. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And the wolves would never, ever come to her door again. Margaret Collins never spent a single night in a municipal shelter. The neon orange eviction notice that once threatened to end her life became the catalyst for its greatest chapter. At 75, she proved that power does not always reside in glass skyscrapers or billionaire bank accounts. Sometimes, it is buried in the dust of a locked cellar, waiting for the right moment to see the light. She transformed a legacy of shadowy blackmail into a beacon of community hope, dismantling a ruthless empire to build shelters, libraries, and affordable homes across Boston. 42 Sycamore Street remained untouched, its garden blooming brighter than ever. Beatrice Montgomery had hoarded the city's darkest secrets to protect herself, but Margaret used them to protect everyone else. In the end, the woman who had nothing but $22 and a locked door found the key to change the world.